So again, we've got the thesis. We're looking at we're looking at the thesis here on the screen. How did Plessy v. Ferguson change how the race was integrated into the everyday life of American society? Again, your thesis question should have multiple parts. It should allow you to kind of answer different things. And then when you're looking at your research should be driven by that question. So as you're going through this, your first part, I mean, if we're looking at kind of the different parts here, how did Plessy v. Ferguson change how the race was integrated into everyday life? Now, first of all, I'm going to maybe help out a little bit here. I haven't really done a lot of editing of this. I'm going to say that I would make that. Oops, sorry. That's making a lot of noise. That's my bad. And I actually don't know if there's anybody in this class. I didn't really look that hard when I was looking at it. It might have been another class. So I would change that to how did Plessy v. Ferguson change how, African Americans were. And let's see. How African Americans were integrated into the everyday life of American society. So that's the first thing I would change. But that leads us to several parts. How did Plessy v. Ferguson change how, and again, this is going to say African Americans were integrated into the everyday life of American society? Okay, so that is maybe the first thing we have to answer. What norms did it generate? It's the second part of our question. As a result, how did this change how the civil rights movement impacted? I don't really know how to do that. Let's see. This is my attempt at editing on an iPad here. Okay. How did this change how the civil rights movement impacted American society? So this is a complex question, and I'm very happy with that. That is not by any means a criticism. And when I say this is a complex question, I mean this one sentence of this question is a complex question, because you're saying, as a result, how did this change how the civil rights movement impacted American society? You're not just saying, how did this impact American society? You're saying, how did this change impact, or how did this change how the civil rights movement impacted? So it's like you're asking kind of two parts there. How might it have been impacted to begin with? And then now, how did this Plessy v. Ferguson ruling change that? So I'm going to assume that the person who wrote this didn't mean it to be that complex, and I'm just going to say that this is 1/3 part instead of it being like 3A and 3B. And say that they probably meant, how did this impact, how did this impact maybe the civil rights movement, or how did this impact American society, right? Instead of how did it change how the civil rights movement impacted society. I don't know if maybe everyone sees that distinction, but there is a distinction between saying, how did this change how it was impacted, and then how did it just impact it, right? There's levels to that. I'm going to assume you just mean how did it impact it. And so that'll be part 3. And already did that. How did this impact American society? If you did mean it that way, if this is one of you, again, I don't know. If you did mean it that way, by all means, keep it that way. I think that's an interesting question. I would love to see how you answer that. If not, you might go back and edit that part. So let's look at this now. We've got 3 parts that we have to answer. How did Plessy v. Ferguson change how African Americans were integrated into the everyday life of American society? And what norms did it generate as a result? How did this change how the civil rights movement impacted American society? We need to know how Plessy v. Ferguson changed the integration of American life into society. Okay, there's a little bit, I mean, you might, again, when you're doing change, you have to know before and after, right? What was it like before and what was it like after? So integration before Plessy v. Ferguson was one thing with like Reconstruction, and then after Plessy v. Ferguson was another thing altogether. Okay, so how did it change? What norms were generated because of Plessy v. Ferguson? Love that question. I think that is huge, right? And then you're going to say, how did that impact the civil rights movement, right? And I really like the idea of saying, how did it change how? Because again, I said you could do 3 and 3B because of these norms that it created, right? Then we're talking about, that's one of the things that the civil rights movement was even aiming at having to deal with, as opposed to just voting rights, things of that nature. It created this Jim Crow kind of society that had to be targeted with the civil rights movement. Okay, so once you have your question, you know what parts of your question you're looking at, then you have to kind of get down to the brass tacks of answering the question. A lot of times with answering a question, you kind of are asked to do the 5 W's and how. So who, what, when, where, why, how. You can include all of those, right? But I don't know that you necessarily need to. I would say for sure you need, let's see if I can do this relatively quickly. For sure you need who. Make that bigger. No, I'm not, because I didn't do that correctly. Okay, so for sure, I would say you need who. Sorry, I feel like I've said that wrong. You definitely want what. Let's start with what. So anyway, so you want what? You definitely want how. Let me put that down here. You definitely want how. And yeah, I would say you probably, yeah, you want who. Okay, I'm sorry. My apologies for being crazy. Okay. In general. I was thinking of this earlier and I was doing something else while I was doing it, and I kind of forgot what I thought, what I had written down to do. So anyway, here we are. Okay, who, what, and how in general is what you are going to need. Okay, so your who, usually you think that's a person. So in order to maybe kind of understand this a little bit better, I will add, just in general, your who is sort of your like thing. Who is probably your topic. Or my bad handwriting. Your what is the action, like what they did. So I say that to say, like, if you're talking about a thing, like you would assume that that's the what, right? Because it's not a who. And so in this case, I'm kind of just aligning what you're doing there. And so you've got your topic, your that's your who, your what is like the action. We'll explain that in a minute. And your how is just how they did it, how it happened. You can also, just depending on if you're putting into context, let's say your who is a little bit more like you're saying, like Black activist, right? Well, that's not specific enough. So if you're going to say Black activists and you're talking about like Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and like others who started the NAACP, so on and so forth, if that's what you're going to do, then you should probably also include when. So instead of saying like Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois did this thing, you're saying Black activists at the turn of the 20th century, that's your when, did this thing, right? That way, so just know that that can kind of still be there. It's the same with where, right? If you say Plessy v. Ferguson and you're talking about American society, you don't actually need to say where, right? Because you kind of said it, it's clear in what you're saying. But if you're saying like if your audience maybe doesn't know where it's happening. So if you said discrimination laws cause this thing, right? You should probably say discrimination laws passed in southern states, right, cause this thing. So just kind of know your idea is to be as specific as possible, but you always need who, what, and how. All right. Are there any questions about that before I continue? Okay. So in this case, we're going to look at we're going to move that up just a little bit. We're going to start with kind of answering this question. And I'm kind of just making this up. I haven't really done enough research necessarily to say this outright. So again, if you're doing this, you should probably, answer your own question your own way. But how did Plessy v. Ferguson change how African Americans were integrated into the everyday life of American society? Okay, so we've got we know the actions we're looking for are those three things, right? Integrated into society, what norms did it generate, and how did that impact American society? Okay, so we know in this case that our who is really just Plessy v. Ferguson. It's not complex in this case. Sometimes it may be. Sometimes, just like we have three things here, you may say, how did laws such as the Civil Rights Act of this era and the Voting Rights Act of this era? So your who may be complex. So just again, you're identifying different things. We've already identified it. We're only really talking about Plessy v. Ferguson here. So how did, and your who is Plessy v. Ferguson, because that's your topic. How did Plessy v. Ferguson, and we know that. So then we come down to the what, and we say Plessy v. Ferguson. I'm just making sure I have everything here. Okay, and this is more complicated. Changed the process for integration. And I'm going to add a little where here. Let me think though before I say that. Change the process for integration. Okay, let me go back. Change the process for integration. Created I'm going to say racist, I don't know, societal norms. Okay, I got this. Change the process for integration. And we want to say hurry up. There we go. Change the process for integration. And let's see. And create, oops. Created racist norms requiring reform in the 1960s. Changed the process for integration and created racist norms requiring reform in the 1960s, which answers all part of our questions already, right? And I'm going to actually undo that. So again, it's how did Plessy v. Ferguson change how African Americans were integrated into everyday life of American society? We haven't really answered that yet, but that's the next part. But we've addressed it. And what norms did it generate? We've talked about that, racist norms. And then how it impacted society is that it required reform in the 1960s. And we're going to say by creating a, this is maybe too much, but here we go, legally sanctioned separation, legally sanctioned separation of, I don't know, I'm gonna say blacks and whites. In the Jim Crow South. Okay, so we've got all parts here. We've even got a where, we've even got a when. You don't have to have those, but that just kind of gives you that. And then what you're essentially going to do is to make an effort to kind of put that together, if I can here. No. So we're going to say Plessy v. Ferguson changed the process for, and I forgot already, changed the process for integration and created integration and created racist norms requiring reform in the 19 Kimmon. Reform in the 1960s by, make sure that I got that right, creating a legally sanctioned separation of blacks and whites in the Jim Crow South. Creating a legally sanctioned separation. Yeah. Oops. Crow South. Okay. I think that answers the question. Pleasure. That's funny. Really? Things are so difficult. Okay. Plessy v. Ferguson changed the process for integration and created racist norms requiring reform in the 1960s by creating a legally sanctioned separation of blacks and whites in the Jim Crow South. Okay, so what we've done here is we've taken the question, we've broken it down into its parts. We have multiple parts. It allows your research to be kind of wide. So what we've done here is, again, we've said without maybe reservation that there are these multiple parts to this question. We're looking, when you're doing your research, now you have 3 different things you can look at. You have 2 other topics that you've picked that are before or after, however you're looking at it, that are going to connect, that you can use and talk about those things to make these points specifically, so you know exactly what you're looking for. How did Plessy v. Ferguson change how did Plessy v. Ferguson change how African Americans were integrated into the everyday life of American society, and what norms did it generate as a result? How did this change how the civil rights movement impacted American society? We've broken that down into its three parts. We've looked for the who, what, and how specifically. Remember, it always has to have those three, is what I'm telling you. The who is your topic. The what is what that topic did, what that action was. Again, Plessy v. Ferguson changed the process for integration. You're always talking about your topic doing some action in this case. And then how they did that, how that happened. You can also, if you need to be more specific, add a where, which I did, the Jim Crow South. And I added a when in talking about the reform in the 1960s. You could also say that Jim Crow South is a time period. And so sometimes you'll do that. You'll see that if you say the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, or again, if you could say something about in the World War II era, something that is a when. And so you could kind of do that as well. And that how, again, is how did that happen? What pieces caused that to occur? And when we put it all together, we come up with a pretty solid thesis that can inform your entire project. This would be something you would say in your documentary, or would go on the front page of your website. Plessy v. Ferguson changed the process for integration and created racist norms requiring reform in the 1960s by creating a legally sanctioned separation of blacks and whites in the Jim Crow South. Okay, so what we've done here, again, is write a thesis statement. Give me 1 second. I'm going to flip over to here for my sake, not necessarily yours. And so we've written a thesis statement that you can submit. You'll submit this online on Canvas, but you'll also put it on your Noodle tools so that you have that right there. If you're going to change this at some point, and you may, and that's perfectly fine. If you're going to change this at some point, I highly recommend that you recommend that you change it on your Noodle tools, so that, again, it's right there all the time in front of you while you're doing your research. It's kind of guiding what you're doing. And don't be afraid to change it. If you recognize, oh, that's not what it did, that's not what happened, that's not how this occurred, don't be afraid to change it. So that's what you should be able to do. And let me say this as well. When you are writing for any reason in this class, if it's a DBQ, or if it's like a test question or something like that, I'm asking you to do this same process all the time. You just happen to have written this question, so you know the parts and you can break it down. You know what you mean. If I give you a question to respond to, I'm still asking you to do this. Break it down to what parts it's asking for, and then look at the who, the what, and the how. And try to write your thesis. That's the claim you're making. That's always what you're doing, always, always, always in history, is trying to use the information you have to make a claim and then back it up with evidence. That's all we're doing here. We're just doing it in a more complicated, maybe stretched out process. Okay, so I'm interested in seeing your theses and seeing what you come up with. It should be based on your questions. And that should hopefully do what we need to get done. Are there any questions for me about this process? Is there anything that I can do to maybe further alleviate any questions?